There was a point in my life when I desperately wanted to get back to work, and God told me to stop. At the time, I didn't understand it. Actually, I hated it because I had just come out of 44 days in prison back in Johannesburg, South Africa. I had bills, waiting for me. Things had already piled up, you know. I had responsibilities, and everything inside of me was saying, get back to your feet, go and work, make money, fix your life, nobody cares. So imagine how confusing it was to feel that God is telling me to stop, not slow down, not, change direction, stop. And I didn't know, then that stopping actually was preparing, me for what was coming next. Welcome to WANWON, Wanderings and Wanderings. And I think this is probably one of the most honest conversations that I've ever had since I started this. Because for a long time, I didn't tell, people that I was coming home. And I came back to Nigeria quietly. No announcements, no explanations, no. You know, no, hey guys, I'm back, nothing like that. I just came home. And today I want to tell you a little bit about why. Not because I'm ready to tell you everything, I'm not, but because I think there's something in this story that might be bigger than, my own story. It's about what happens when God asks you to stop. When everything around you is telling you to, keep going, you got bills to pay, you gotta make money, all that type of stuff. After I came out of prison, I wanted, my life back. I wanted to work. I wanted to make money. I wanted to deal with, everything that had accumulated, while I was gone. And I knew how to survive. You know, I've been doing that for years. So going back to work, it felt like the obvious thing to do. But something had already changed. I would think about going back outside, to my shop to do business, and I couldn't find peace. I would think about, reopening my shop, and something inside of me would resist. And it confused me because it wasn't that, I didn't want to work. I wanted to work. I needed to make money. I had bills. I had responsibilities. But every time that I tried, to force myself back into the life that I had before, something in me said no. And eventually I had to ask myself, what if this is not fear? Because truth be told, I wasn't afraid. What if this is instruction? So I stopped. I stayed home, and that was one of, the hardest things I have ever had to do. Because when you have lived in survival mode for a long time, resting, can feel like irresponsible. Silence can feel like you are wasting time. Not making money can feel like you are failing. And trusting God when you don't even know how your next need is going to be met, it's a completely, different kind of faith. For about 3 or 4 months, I stayed away from my business. I stayed home. I tried to heal. I tried to understand what had just happened to me. And honestly, there were moments when I questioned whether I was making, the right decision because I couldn't see, what was ahead at that time. I only knew what I had been told. Stop. And then things started to happen outside. The xenophobic attacks against Africans in South Africa began getting worse. I remember looking at everything, that was happening and I'm thinking, maybe this is the part of the reason I was told to stay inside. I can't sit here and tell you that I understand every reason, God does what he does. I don't. But looking backwards, I began to see something I couldn't see when I was, standing in the middle of it. Sometimes obedience, makes sense backwards. When God tells you to move, you may understand, later. When he tells you to stay, you may understand later. When he tells you to stop, you may understand later. And that's one of the hardest things, and that's one of the hardest parts of faith. Because we want the explanation before the obedience. But sometimes you get the instructions first, and the understanding actually comes afterwards. So eventually I knew I needed to come home. And even that, it wasn't an easy decision to make. Because South Africa wasn't just a place I had lived. It had been, my life. I'd spent years there. I've built there, I've struggled there, I've even loved there. I'd lost there. There was a whole version of me that was attached to that place. And then I was coming back to Nigeria. I remember getting off the plane, my brother, came to pick me up. And we got into the car, and then Lagos started introducing itself to me again. The heat, the humidity, the traffic, the buses, the horns. Oh God. People shouting, everywhere. Cars everywhere, the roads, the impatience of people, the noise, everything. And I remember thinking, yeah, I'm really home. But it was strange, eh? Because part of me was relieved. And another part of me was, thinking, what now? So what now? I had no grand plan. I wasn't coming back with, everything figured out. I wasn't coming back with a business empire. I wasn't coming back with all the answers. I was simply coming back because I believed that was where I needed to be. And that is why I didn't tell many people. It was not, really about being afraid of what, people would say. It wasn't even about shame. I just I just didn't have the desire to explain myself. There had been, so much noise in my life, so many things that happened, so many decisions, so many voices. And I think for once, I wanted to hear my own voice. Or more importantly, I wanted to I wanted to hear God. I wanted to hear the voice of God. Even leaving South Africa, I didn't feel peace about announcing it. There were people that I could have told, people I probably should have, you sent a text to or just called or stuff like that. But something in me just said, leave quietly. And so I did. I didn't even know exactly what the next chapter would look like. I just knew that I needed to protect the little peace that I found. And maybe you have experienced something like that. Maybe not, moving countries, maybe not leaving, a life behind, but maybe you have entered a season where you don't want to explain yourself anymore. You don't want to announce what you're doing. You don't want everybody asking, so what's happening, with you? How are you? How are you going to survive? What happened? All those questions. Because sometimes you are still trying to understand what is happening with you. And I think that is okay. You don't owe anybody access to a chapter they are not helping you to write.